My name is Madison, I'm 28, and I thought I understood my family until Christmas morning shattered every assumption I'd ever held. While my sister Jessica received the keys to a brand new Lexus worth $117,000, I unwrapped a $5 coffee mug from the gas station down the street. But that wasn't even the worst part. The next morning, when I confronted my mom about the glaring inequality, she didn't just brush me off or make excuses. She completely snapped and revealed a family secret so devastating that it would destroy relationships, expose decades of lies, and ultimately lead to the most satisfying revenge I never saw coming. Before we dive into how Christmas morning became a battlefield and why my mother's breakdown changed everything forever, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're ready for a family drama that'll make your jaw drop. Trust me, you'll want to subscribe because this story gets wilder with every twist. Christmas morning at the Richardson house had always been a carefully orchestrated performance, but this year felt different from the moment I walked through the front door. My parents had insisted we all gather at their sprawling suburban home in Connecticut, the same house where Jessica and I had grown up, though our childhoods couldn't have been more different. Jessica arrived fashionably late, as always, her designer boots clicking against the hardwood floors as she swept into the living room like she owned the place. At 31, she'd mastered the art of making every entrance feel like a grand reveal. Her honey blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite claiming she'd just thrown something on. Meanwhile, I'd driven 4 hours from my tiny apartment in Boston, wearing jeans and a sweater I'd bought on clearance 3 years ago. "Madison. You made it." Mom chirped, though her enthusiasm felt forced, like she was reading lines from a script. Dad barely looked up from his coffee, giving me the same distant nod he'd perfected over the years. It was the kind of greeting you'd give a neighbor you barely knew, not your daughter who'd driven through a snowstorm to be there. The present distribution began with the usual fanfare. Mom had arranged everything under the tree with military precision, each gift wrapped in coordinating paper and tied with elaborate bows. Jessica's pile towered over everyone else's, a mountain of boxes in various shapes and sizes that practically screamed expensive. My pile consisted of 3 modestly sized packages that looked almost embarrassed to be there. "Jessica, honey, why don't you open this one first?" Mom practically vibrated with excitement as she handed over an envelope that clearly contained something significant. Dad had his phone out, ready to capture every moment of what was obviously a planned surprise. Jessica's perfectly manicured fingers tore open the envelope with theatrical care, her eyes widening as she pulled out what appeared to be car keys attached to a Lexus keychain. "Oh my God, you didn't," she squealed, though her reaction felt rehearsed, like she'd been expecting this exact moment. "Go look in the driveway, sweetheart," Dad said, his voice warm with pride in a way I hadn't heard directed at me in years. The next 20 minutes were a blur of screaming, crying, and photo opportunities as Jessica discovered her brand new Lexus SUV sitting in the driveway, complete with a giant red bow that must have cost more than my monthly rent. The car was absolutely stunning, I had to admit, midnight black with cream leather interior, every possible upgrade and feature that money could buy. $117,000, Dad announced proudly, as if the price tag made the gift even more meaningful. Only the best for our successful daughter. Jessica worked in marketing for a mid-sized company, nothing that would warrant this kind of extravagance, but our parents had always found reasons to shower her with expensive gifts. Her promotion last year had been celebrated with a 2-week European vacation. When she'd bought her condo, they'd covered the down payment without blinking. Meanwhile, when I'd graduated with my master's degree in social work, they'd taken us all to Olive Garden. As Jessica posed for approximately 50 photos with her new car, I sat on the porch steps watching the performance unfold. The neighbors had come out to see what all the commotion was about, and Mom was practically glowing as she explained to Mrs. Henderson that yes, it was a Christmas gift, and yes, they were so proud of Jessica's success. When we finally went back inside to continue opening presents, the energy in the room had shifted. Jessica's gift had set a tone that made everything else feel anticlimactic. She opened box after box of designer clothes, expensive jewelry, and electronics, each gift received with the appropriate amount of enthusiasm and gratitude. Then it was my turn. My 3 packages felt even smaller in my hands after witnessing Jessica's haul. The first contained a generic scented candle that still had the clearance sticker on the bottom. The second held a pair of socks with reindeer on them that looked like they'd been grabbed from a last-minute display at the grocery store. The third package was the coffee mug. Plain white ceramic with "World's Okayest Daughter" printed in fading letters that suggested it had been sitting on a shelf somewhere for a very long time. The price tag was still attached, $4.99 from Murphy's gas station, the one literally 5 minutes from our house. The silence in the room was deafening. Even Jessica looked uncomfortable, her smile faltering as she realized the stark difference between our gifts. Dad cleared his throat and mumbled something about how practical gifts were sometimes the most thoughtful, while Mom busied herself cleaning up wrapping paper with unusual intensity. "Thank you," I managed to say, though my voice came out smaller than I intended. "These are great." But inside, something was breaking. Not just because of the obvious financial disparity, but because of what these gifts represented. The thoughtlessness. The afterthought. The way they'd clearly put extensive time, energy, and money into making Jessica's Christmas magical while treating mine like a box to check off a list. As Jessica gushed about taking her new car for a drive and Mom started preparing Christmas dinner, I excused myself to the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me looked tired, defeated, and suddenly very clear about where she stood in this family hierarchy. I'd spent 28 years telling myself that the favoritism wasn't that obvious, that I was being sensitive, that my parents loved us equally in their own way. But holding that $5 mug while Jessica's car keys jangled in the next room, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I barely slept that night in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling while Jessica's new car sat gleaming in the driveway below my window. The house felt different somehow, like the walls themselves were whispering secrets I'd never been meant to hear. By morning, I'd made a decision that would change everything. I was going to confront my parents about the blatant favoritism that had defined my entire life. Mom was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, humming while she prepared what looked like enough breakfast for an army. She'd always been a morning person, but there was something manic about her energy today, like she was trying too hard to maintain the facade of family harmony. "Morning, sweetheart. I'm making Jessica's favorite pancakes. She'll be down soon, she wants to take her new car for a proper drive today." Mom's voice had that forced cheerfulness again, the same tone she used when she was trying to convince herself that everything was perfectly normal. "Mom, we need to talk." I kept my voice calm, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "About yesterday. About the gifts." She paused mid-stir, her knuckles going white around the wooden spoon. "What about them?" "Everyone got lovely presents." "Everyone got presents," I corrected. "But let's not pretend they were equivalent. Jessica got a car worth more than most people's annual salary, and I got a gas station mug." "Madison, honey, you're being dramatic. We've always been generous with both you girls." But she wouldn't meet my eyes, focusing instead on the pancake batter with laser intensity. "Generous with both of us?" The laugh that escaped my throat was bitter. "When Jessica graduated college, you bought her a new car then too. When I graduated, you gave me a card with $50 in it. When she got her promotion, you sent her to Europe. When I got my master's degree, we went to chain restaurant. When she bought her condo, you covered the down payment. When I was struggling to make rent during grad school, you told me it would build character." Mom's stirring had become aggressive, the spoon scraping against the bottom of the bowl with sharp, angry sounds. "That's not, you're remembering things wrong." "Am I? Because I have a pretty clear memory of asking for help with my student loans last year and being told that I needed to be more responsible with money." Meanwhile, Jessica's credit card bills just magically disappear every month. Your sister has always been more ambitious, more driven. She's made something of herself. More than a social worker who helps kids in foster care? My voice was rising now, years of suppressed resentment finally finding their way to the surface. What exactly has she made of herself that's so much more valuable than what I do? Mom slammed the spoon down on the counter, finally turning to face me. Her face was flushed, her carefully styled hair slightly mussed from her aggressive pancake preparation. You want to know the truth, Madison? You really want to know? Something in her tone made my blood run cold. This wasn't the mom who had raised me, the woman who had always maintained perfect composure even during the worst family arguments. This was someone else entirely, someone with wild eyes and a tremor in her voice that spoke of barely contained hysteria. Jessica is not your sister. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to breathe around. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, all the air leaving my lungs in a rush. What did you say? You heard me. Mom's voice had gone deadly quiet now, all the manic energy draining away to leave something cold and hollow behind. Jessica is not your biological sister. She's your father's daughter from an affair he had with his secretary 31 years ago. The kitchen tilted sideways, or maybe I was falling, or maybe the entire world had just shifted on its axis. I grabbed the counter to steady myself, my mind racing to process what she'd just said. That's impossible. You adopted her when she was 3. You told us her parents died in a car accident. You showed us the paperwork. We lied. The words came out flat, matter of fact, like she was discussing the weather. Your father knocked up Linda Morrison in 1993. When her husband found out the baby wasn't his, he left her. She couldn't handle being a single mother, so she gave Jessica to us. Legally, yes, we adopted her. But she's your father's biological daughter. I was going to be sick. Actually, physically sick. The room was spinning, and I could taste bile in the back of my throat. You're lying. You have to be lying. Am I? Haven't you ever wondered why she looks so much like your father? Why she has his eyes, his nose, his stubborn chin? Haven't you ever questioned why they have such a special bond, why he lights up when she walks into a room in a way he never does with you? And suddenly, horribly, it all made sense. The favoritism that had never made logical sense. The way Dad's face transformed when Jessica spoke, like she was the most fascinating person in the world. The way Mom sometimes looked at Jessica with something that wasn't quite love, wasn't quite resentment, but something complicated and painful that lived somewhere between the two. Why are you telling me this? My voice came out as a whisper. Mom's laugh was sharp and bitter. Because you wanted the truth. Because you keep pushing and pushing about fairness and equality when you don't understand anything about what this family has been through. You think it's been easy for me? Raising another woman's child? Watching my husband pour his love and attention into his affair baby while treating his legitimate daughter like an afterthought? His legitimate daughter? I repeated, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. Oh yes, Madison. You want to know another truth? Your father never wanted children. I had to beg him to try for a baby, and when you came along, he acted like you were a burden he had to bear. But Jessica? Jessica was different. She was proof of his virility, his charm, his ability to win women over. She was never supposed to exist, but now that she does, she's the most important thing in his world. The pancake batter sat forgotten on the counter, slowly deflating like my entire understanding of my family. 28 years of feeling like the odd one out, of wondering what was wrong with me that I couldn't earn my father's love, of watching my parents light up around Jessica while treating me like furniture they'd grown used to ignoring. Does Jessica know? I asked. God, no. And if you tell her, I will make your life a living hell. She thinks she's just the adopted daughter who got lucky with loving parents. She has no idea that she's the product of her father's infidelity and the reason our marriage almost didn't survive her first 5 years of life. I stared at this woman who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bike and helped with homework and kissed scraped knees, and realized I didn't know her at all. The mother I thought I understood was a stranger wearing a familiar face. I need to go. I backed toward the kitchen door, desperate to escape before I said something I couldn't take back. Madison, wait. But I was already gone, grabbing my keys and coat and fleeing the house that had never really felt like home anyway. As I drove away, Jessica's new Lexus caught the morning sunlight like a beacon, a monument to 31 years of lies and the father who had never really been mine at all. The truth was out now, hanging between us like a blade. But as I drove back toward Boston, my mind was already spinning with a different kind of clarity. If my family wanted to play games, if they wanted to operate on lies and deception and favoritism disguised as love, then maybe it was time I learned to play by their rules. But this time I would be the one writing them. The 4-hour drive back to Boston gave me plenty of time to process the nuclear bomb my mother had just dropped into my life, and by the time I pulled into my apartment complex, something fundamental had shifted inside me. The hurt was still there, raw and bleeding, but it was being slowly consumed by something far more useful, cold, calculating anger. I spent the next 3 days in a strange state of hyperclarity, like someone had suddenly brought my entire life into sharp focus after 28 years of blurry confusion. Every family memory was recontextualized through this new lens of truth. Every awkward family dinner, every milestone celebration where I felt like an outsider, every time I'd wondered what was wrong with me that I couldn't seem to earn my father's love, it all finally made terrible, perfect sense. But knowledge, I was learning, was power. And I intended to use every bit of it. My first call was to my best friend Sarah, who I'd known since college and who had always served as my voice of reason during family crises. She listened in stunned silence as I recounted the Christmas morning revelation, occasionally interjecting with creative curse words that made me smile despite everything. Jesus Christ, Madison. I always knew your family was dysfunctional, but this is next-level soap opera stuff. Sarah's voice was thick with indignation on my behalf. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. But I'm done being the family doormat. I'm done pretending that their treatment of me is normal or acceptable. I was pacing around my tiny living room, nervous energy crackling through my body like electricity. They want to keep secrets and play favorites? Fine. But they're about to learn that I'm not the pushover they think I am. Madison, I love your righteous anger, but be careful. These people raised you, and despite everything, you still have to live with whatever choices you make here. But that was the thing, I was starting to realize that maybe I didn't have to live with it. Maybe the family I'd been desperately trying to belong to my entire life wasn't worth belonging to at all. My second call was to my Uncle Robert, my dad's younger brother who had always been the family black sheep. Robert had cut ties with our family years ago after some kind of falling out that was never fully explained to me, and I'd always wondered what had caused such a permanent rift between the brothers. Now I was starting to suspect I knew. Madison? Well, this is a surprise. I haven't heard from you since you were in high school. Robert's voice was cautious but not unkind. He lived in California now, had built a successful consulting business, and from what I'd gathered through family gossip, was happily married with 2 kids I'd never met. Uncle Robert, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. I took a deep breath. Did you know about Jessica? About who her real father is? The silence stretched so long I thought the call might have dropped. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was heavy with something that sounded like relief. So they finally told you. I wondered how long they'd be able to keep that charade going. He sighed deeply. Yeah, kiddo, I knew. I was the one who told your father he needed to come clean when Jessica was 5 years old. That's why we stopped talking. He chose protecting his guilty conscience over maintaining our relationship. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out sharper than I intended. Because it wasn't my secret to tell, and because I hoped against hope that your parents would eventually do the right thing and give you the explanation you deserved. Robert paused. But also because I was protecting myself. Walking away from your family was the healthiest thing I ever did, Madison. Your father has always been a selfish, manipulative man who thinks his charm can excuse any amount of damage he causes. Tell me everything, I said, settling into my couch with my notebook. I need to understand what I'm dealing with. What Robert told me over the next hour painted a picture of my father that was both shocking and somehow completely expected. The affair with Linda Morrison hadn't been a one-time mistake, it had been a full-blown relationship that lasted over 2 years. Dad had promised to leave my mother for Linda, had even looked at apartments with her, but when Linda got pregnant, he'd panicked and ended things. Linda was devastated, Robert explained. She loved your father, thought they had a real future together. When he abandoned her, she couldn't bear to raise his child alone. Giving Jessica to your parents seemed like the perfect solution. The child would still be in her father's life, just not in a way that reminded Linda of her heartbreak. And Mom just agreed to this? Your mother was desperate to save her marriage and prove she could be the perfect wife. Taking in Jessica was her way of showing your father that she could forgive anything, be anything he needed. But it destroyed something in her, Madison. She's never been the same since. The pieces were clicking into place with sickening clarity. Mom's occasional sharp comments about Jessica's ingratitude. Dad's obvious preference for his affair baby over his legitimate daughter. The way family photos from my childhood always seemed to feature Jessica front and center while I hovered awkwardly in the background. There's something else, Robert said quietly. Something that might interest you from a legal standpoint. My pulse quickened. What do you mean? Your parents have been hiding Jessica's true parentage from more than just you. Their will, their insurance policies, everything legal still lists you as the sole biological heir. Jessica is legally adopted, yes, but according to their estate planning documents, she's not entitled to anything beyond what any adopted child would receive. Which is what, exactly? In most states, adopted children have equal inheritance rights. But your parents structured their estate in a way that specifically benefits biological children, probably back when they were still trying to punish your father for his affair. If I'm remembering correctly, Jessica would get a small settlement, but everything else, the house, the investments, the life insurance, would go to you. My mind was spinning. Are you sure about this? Pretty sure, but you'd need to see the actual documents to know for certain. I helped your father set up the initial trust back in the day, before we stopped speaking. Unless he's changed everything, and given his tendency to avoid difficult conversations, I doubt he has. After we hung up, I sat in my living room staring at the wall, pieces of a plan beginning to form in my mind. My parents had spent 31 years lying to me, manipulating family dynamics, and treating me like a second-class citizen in my own family. They'd used their wealth and favoritism to create a hierarchy that positioned me at the bottom, never realizing that they'd also given me something far more valuable, legal standing. But I needed more information before I could move forward. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with, and I needed allies who could help me navigate the complex emotional and legal terrain ahead. My third call was to my cousin Emma, Robert's daughter, who was 2 years older than me and worked as a paralegal in Los Angeles. Emma and I had been close as kids but had drifted apart when our families stopped speaking. She was smart, fiercely loyal, and had inherited her father's natural skepticism about our family's version of events. Madison. Oh my God, it's been forever. Emma's voice was warm but surprised. Dad just called me, he said you two talked and that some serious family stuff is going down. That's one way to put it, I said, and proceeded to fill her in on the Christmas morning revelation and my conversation with Robert. Holy shit, Emma breathed. I mean, I always thought there was something weird about how your parents treated you and Jessica differently, but this explains so much. She paused. What do you need from me? Information. Legal advice. Maybe some help figuring out how to protect myself if this gets ugly. Consider it done. I have friends who specialize in family law, and I can do some research on inheritance structures in your state. But Madison? I need you to think carefully about what your end goal is here. Are you looking for justice, revenge, or just the truth? It was a good question, one that I'd been avoiding since my conversation with Robert. What did I want? An apology from parents who had never learned how to give one. Financial compensation for 31 years of emotional neglect? For Jessica to know the truth about her parentage? I want them to face consequences for their choices, I said finally. I want them to understand that their lies and favoritism have had real impact on real people. And I want to make sure I never have to depend on them for anything ever again. Those are good goals, Emma said. Specific, achievable, and focused on your own well-being rather than just hurting them back. I can work with that. As I hung up the phone, I realized something had fundamentally changed in how I saw myself and my situation. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the victim of my family's dysfunction, I was a player in the game. And I was going to play to win. The war wasn't going to be fought with screaming matches or dramatic confrontations. It was going to be fought with documentation, legal strategy, and cold, calculated precision. My parents had spent decades underestimating me, treating me like the forgettable daughter who would always come back for more punishment. They were about to learn how wrong they'd been. Over the next 6 weeks, I transformed from the family doormat into something my parents never saw coming, a woman with a plan, resources, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Emma had connected me with her friend Marcus, a family law attorney who specialized in estate disputes and inheritance fraud. What we discovered made my Christmas morning revelation look like a gentle breeze compared to the hurricane that was coming. Marcus had obtained copies of my parents' estate documents through perfectly legal channels, and what we found was even better than Uncle Robert had suggested. Not only were the inheritance structures heavily skewed toward biological children, but my parents had been committing tax fraud for years by claiming Jessica as a dependent while simultaneously hiding the fact that my father was her biological parent. This is a goldmine, Marcus explained during our second meeting, spreading documents across his conference table like he was laying out a winning hand of cards. They'd been filing false tax returns, misrepresenting family structures to insurance companies, and potentially committing identity fraud depending on how they handled Jessica's adoption paperwork. But the real revelation came when Emma's research uncovered something that made my blood run cold. Linda Morrison, Jessica's biological mother, was still alive and living in Oregon. She'd been sending cards and small gifts to Jessica for years through my parents, who had been intercepting them and throwing them away. She's been trying to maintain contact? I stared at the stack of returned letters Emma had somehow managed to track down through a private investigator friend. More than that, Emma said, her voice tight with anger. She's been sending money too. Small amounts, but consistent. Birthday cards with $20 bills, Christmas gifts, graduation money when Jessica finished college. Your parents have been stealing from both of them for over a decade. The scope of my parents' deception was breathtaking in its cruelty. They hadn't just lied about Jessica's parentage, they'd actively prevented her from knowing her biological mother, a woman who clearly loved her and wanted to be part of her life. They'd stolen money, intercepted emotional correspondence, and built their family's entire structure on a foundation of lies and manipulation. What's our next move? I asked Marcus. We document everything, build an airtight case, and then we give your parents a choice. They can voluntarily restructure their estate and make full disclosure to Jessica about her parentage and her mother's attempts at contact, or we can take this to court and let a judge decide how to handle 31 years of fraud and emotional abuse. But I wasn't ready to show my hand yet. I needed more leverage, more information, and most importantly, I needed to make sure that Jessica would be protected when the truth inevitably came out. Because despite everything, despite the favoritism and the lies and the way she'd been used as a weapon against me my entire life, Jessica was as much a victim in this situation as I was. That's when I decided to do something that would either be brilliant or completely insane. I was going to contact Linda Morrison directly. Finding her wasn't difficult once I knew where to look. Linda Morrison had remarried, was now Linda Patterson, and lived in a small town outside Portland where she worked as a nurse and had built what appeared to be a quiet, peaceful life. According to Emma's research, she'd never had other children. I drove to Oregon on a long weekend, my heart hammering the entire 8-hour journey as I practiced what I was going to say. How do you approach a woman whose life was destroyed by your father and tell her that her daughter, the child she gave up but never stopped loving, was living a lie? Linda's house was small but well-maintained, with a garden that spoke of careful attention and a life built around simple pleasures. When she answered the door, I saw Jessica's face looking back at me, older, more weathered, marked by years of pain that I was only beginning to understand, but unmistakably the source of my sister's features. "You're Madison," she said softly, and I realized she'd been expecting this moment for a very long time. "You look just like your mother did when she was young. Before my father destroyed your life?" I finished. Linda's smile was sad but not bitter. "Before we all made choices that hurt more people than we intended. Come in, honey. I think it's time we talked." What Linda told me over the next 3 hours filled in the final pieces of the puzzle I'd been assembling. She'd loved my father deeply, had believed his promises about leaving my mother, had planned a future that included raising Jessica together. When he'd abandoned her, she'd been devastated, but she'd tried to do what she thought was best for her daughter. I thought if Jessica grew up with her father, even if he wasn't with me, at least she'd have stability and opportunities one couldn't give her as a single mother in 1993, Linda explained, tears streaming down her face. "I never stopped loving her, never stopped thinking about her, never stopped hoping that someday I'd be able to tell her how much she meant to me. The letters and money you sent never reached her, did they?" Linda's voice was heavy with resignation. "I suspected as much when I never heard back, but I kept hoping. Every birthday, every Christmas, every major milestone, I sent something, even though I knew the chances were slim. Linda, there's something you need to know. My parents have been lying to Jessica about more than just your existence. They've been using her as a weapon in their marriage, treating her like a prize while making me feel like an afterthought. But they've also been committing fraud, stealing from both of you, and building a family dynamic that's hurt everyone involved." Linda listened as I explained what Emma and Marcus had discovered, her expression shifting from sadness to anger to something that looked like determination. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "I need you to be ready to tell Jessica the truth when the time comes. I need you to be willing to testify about what really happened 31 years ago if this goes to court. And I need you to help me figure out how to protect Jessica when everything falls apart. Honey, I've been ready for 31 years. When I drove back to Boston, I had everything I needed. Legal documentation of my parents' fraud, testimony from the woman they'd been victimizing, evidence of theft and emotional abuse, and most importantly, a clear understanding of what justice would actually look like. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth, accountability, and making sure that Jessica finally got the relationship with her biological mother that had been stolen from both of them. It was about protecting myself from further manipulation and ensuring that my parents faced real consequences for their choices. The war was about to begin, and for the first time in my life, I was going to win. The confrontation happened on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in February. I'd spent weeks preparing, gathering evidence, and coordinating with Marcus and Linda to ensure that when I finally made my move, it would be decisive and irreversible. I chose to meet my parents at their house, the same place where my childhood had been systematically undermined by lies and favoritism. Mom answered the door looking older than I remembered, her face drawn and her eyes holding a wariness that suggested she'd been dreading this moment since our Christmas morning conversation. Dad was in his study, surrounded by the law books and awards that had always made him feel important, though they seemed diminished somehow in the face of what I was about to reveal. "Madison, what a lovely surprise," Mom said, though her voice carried no conviction. "Your father and I were just discussing whether we should call you about the holidays next year. Actually, I'm here because we need to discuss something much more important than holiday plans." I set my briefcase down on the coffee table with deliberate precision, enjoying the way both my parents' eyes immediately focused on it with the intensity of prey animals sensing a predator. "What's all this about, honey?" Dad's tone was carefully modulated, the same voice he used when he was trying to manage a difficult client. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against his desk. "This is about 31 years of lies, fraud, and emotional manipulation. This is about Jessica's real parentage, Linda Morrison, and the systematic way you've been stealing from and lying to everyone in this family." I opened the briefcase and began arranging documents on the table with the methodical precision Marcus had taught me. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom sank into her chair like someone had cut her strings, while Dad's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious: denial, anger, calculation, and finally something that looked like panic. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," Dad began, but I cut him off with a gesture. "Tax returns showing Jessica claimed as your dependent while simultaneously hiding her true parentage. Insurance fraud documents. Copies of intercepted letters and stolen money from Linda Morrison. Bank records showing systematic financial favoritism. Estate documents structured to exclude Jessica despite 31 years of lies about family equality." Each document landed on the table like a small explosion. Should I continue? Mom was crying now, silent tears that streaked her makeup and made her look every one of her 63 years. "Madison, you don't understand the complexity of the situation. We were trying to protect everyone involved." "Protect everyone?" My voice was deadly calm, the product of weeks of preparation for this moment. "You've been systematically destroying relationships, stealing money, committing fraud, and lying to your own children for 3 decades. Exactly who were you protecting?" Dad had found his voice again, falling back on the aggressive bluster that had always been his default when cornered. "You're being dramatic, Madison. Families are complicated, and we did the best we could with a difficult situation." "The best you could do was intercept letters from a woman trying to maintain contact with her daughter? The best you could do was steal birthday money and Christmas gifts? The best you could do was structure your estate to financially punish Jessica while emotionally punishing me?" "Jessica is adopted," Dad said, his lawyer voice fully engaged now. "The legal structures reflect that reality. Jessica is your biological daughter, and you know it. Linda Morrison knows it. Uncle Robert knows it. And now I know it, along with several attorneys who are very interested in how you've been handling the legal and financial implications of that fact." The moment when the fight went out of them was almost visible. Dad's shoulders slumped, and Mom's crying became audible, broken sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and damaged inside her. "What do you want from us?" Mom whispered. "I want you to call Jessica and tell her the truth. All of it. Her real parentage, Linda's existence, the letters and money you've been stealing, everything. I want you to restructure your estate honestly and fairly. I want you to facilitate a meeting between Jessica and Linda if that's what Jessica chooses. And I want you to understand that your days of manipulating and lying to this family are over." "And if we refuse?" Dad's voice was small, defeated. "Then my attorney takes this to court, Jessica finds out the truth in the most public and humiliating way possible, and you face criminal charges for fraud and theft. Your choice." The next 24 hours were a masterclass in watching a carefully constructed house of lies collapse in real time. Mom called Jessica first, though I have no idea what she said during that initial conversation. All I know is that Jessica showed up at the house 2 hours later, her face white with shock and confusion. The family meeting that followed was brutal in its honesty. Dad, faced with the complete exposure of his deceptions, finally told the truth about his affair with Linda, about Jessica's parentage, about the years of intercepted communication and stolen gifts. Mom, perhaps freed by the end of her decades-long charade, spoke with raw honesty about the pain of raising another woman's child while watching her husband lavish attention on his affair baby. Jessica said very little during the initial revelation, but I watched her face carefully, seeing the same pieces clicking into place that I'd experienced weeks earlier. The favoritism that had never made sense to her, the special bond with Dad that she'd never questioned, the way Mom sometimes looked at her with something that wasn't quite maternal love. "I need to see the letters," was the first thing she said when our parents finished their confessions. Mom brought out a box from the hall closet, a container I'd walked past thousands of times without knowing it held 31 years of stolen communication. Jessica's hand shook as she opened cards and letters from a woman who had never stopped loving her, never stopped hoping for contact, never stopped believing that someday they might have a relationship. "She wanted to know me," Jessica whispered, her voice breaking as she read birthday cards that were years old, Christmas greetings that had never reached her, graduation congratulations that had been intercepted and hidden. "She still does," I said softly. "I've spoken with her. She's been waiting her entire adult life for the chance to know you." The conversation that followed changed everything. Jessica learned about the estate structures that had been designed to favor me legally while favoring her emotionally. She learned about the tax fraud and insurance manipulation. She learned about Uncle Robert's estrangement from the family and Linda's continued presence in Oregon. But most importantly, she learned that both of us had been victims of our parents' inability to deal honestly with the consequences of their choices. "I need time," Jessica said finally. "I need to process this, and I need to decide what I want my relationships to look like going forward." As she gathered up the letters and prepared to leave, she turned to me with something that looked like gratitude mixed with grief. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she said. "Even though it's going to change everything." "Everything was already changed," I replied. "We just didn't know it." 6 months later, I stood in Linda Patterson's backyard in Oregon, watching Jessica meet her biological mother for the first time in 31 years. It was awkward and emotional and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once, the kind of moment that redefines what family actually means when you strip away all the lies and manipulation and legal structures. Linda had prepared for weeks, nervous about what to say, how to act, whether Jessica would even want to see her. Jessica had driven up from California, where she'd relocated after deciding that staying in Connecticut was too painful given everything she'd learned about her childhood. They stood facing each other in the garden, two women who shared DNA and decades of stolen time, trying to figure out how to build a relationship from scratch. "You have her eyes," I said to Linda as we watched Jessica examine the rose bushes with the same careful attention to detail that had always characterized her approach to everything. "She has her father's stubbornness though," Linda replied with a sad smile. "She gets that intense focus when she's thinking through something difficult." Jessica had indeed inherited Dad's analytical mind, which she'd been applying to the wreckage of our family with surgical precision. She'd hired her own attorney to review the estate documents and financial structures. She'd demanded full disclosure of all intercepted communications and stolen gifts. And she'd made it clear to our parents that their relationship with her going forward would depend entirely on their willingness to be honest and make amends. Mom and Dad had responded to Jessica's ultimatum about as well as could be expected from people whose entire sense of family control had been systematically dismantled. Mom had entered therapy, finally acknowledging that 31 years of resentment and complicated grief had turned her into someone she didn't recognize. Dad had restructured the estate to be genuinely equitable and had written letters of apology to both Linda and Uncle Robert, though I doubted either response was entirely sincere. The most surprising development had been Jessica's reaction to learning about the inheritance structures. Rather than feeling betrayed by the legal favoritism toward me, she'd been relieved to discover that our parents' financial manipulation hadn't been as comprehensive as their emotional manipulation. I never wanted their money, she'd explained during one of our long conversations as we worked through the aftermath of our family's implosion. I always felt guilty about how much they spent on me, like I was somehow taking something that should have been yours. Knowing that you were legally protected makes it easier for me to build boundaries around what I'm willing to accept from them going forward. Those boundaries had been swift and decisive. Jessica had returned the Lexus with a note explaining that she preferred to buy her own car with money she'd actually earned. She'd refused their offer to pay for her relocation to California. And she'd made it clear that future contact would happen on her terms, when she was ready, if she was ever ready. Our relationship had undergone its own transformation. The artificial sibling dynamic that had been built on lies and competition had evolved into something more authentic and ultimately more valuable. We weren't trying to be sisters in the traditional sense anymore, we were two women who had survived the same toxic family system and were helping each other build something healthier. I used to be so jealous of you, Jessica admitted during one of our phone calls. You seemed so independent, so capable of building a life without constantly needing their approval. I was addicted to their attention, even when part of me knew there was something unhealthy about it. I was jealous of you too, I replied. But I think we were both jealous of illusions. You weren't really getting love, you were getting manipulation disguised as favoritism. And I wasn't really being ignored, I was being systematically undermined to maintain their sense of control. The legal aftermath had been swift and decisive. Marcus had negotiated a settlement that included financial compensation for the intercepted gifts and fraudulent tax filings, along with a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Dad had been quietly censured by the State Bar Association for ethical violations related to the estate fraud. Mom had been required to undergo family therapy as part of the settlement agreement. But the most meaningful resolution had nothing to do with legal consequences or financial restitution. Linda and Jessica had begun building a relationship based on honesty and mutual respect rather than stolen moments and intercepted letters. Uncle Robert had re-established contact with me and had been working to repair his relationship with Dad, though that process was moving much more slowly. And I had finally, for the first time in my life, built a family structure that was based on choice rather than obligation, truth rather than manipulation, and genuine care rather than financial leverage. As I watched Jessica and Linda compare notes about gardening techniques, I realized that this was what justice actually looked like. Not revenge or dramatic confrontations or public humiliation, but truth finally being allowed to exist, relationships being built on honest foundations, and people being free to choose their own definitions of family. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, "How's the family reunion going?" I took a photo of Jessica and Linda laughing together over a shared story and sent it back with the caption, "Better than any Christmas morning I ever had." The karma hadn't come in the form of dramatic punishment or poetic justice. It had come in the form of truth finally winning over lies, authentic relationships replacing manipulative ones, and the simple satisfaction of watching people who had spent decades hurting others finally face the natural consequences of their choices. My parents were learning to live with the fact that their children were no longer willing to participate in their dysfunction. Jessica was learning to build relationships based on genuine connection rather than desperate need for approval. Linda was finally getting to know the daughter she'd never stopped loving. And I was learning that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to carry other people's lies anymore. Standing in that garden in Oregon, surrounded by people who had chosen to be honest with each other despite the pain it caused, I realized that I'd finally found what I'd been searching for my entire life, a family that deserved the name. Have you ever discovered a family secret that completely changed how you saw your childhood? Sometimes the most devastating revelations lead to the most healing transformations. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you experienced family karma catching up with people who thought they'd never face consequences? Please hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life family drama stories that prove truth really is stranger than fiction. Share this with anyone who's ever felt like the family scapegoat. Sometimes we need to hear that we're not alone in these experiences. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of this community where we can share these difficult truths. I hope my experience reminds you that you deserve relationships built on honesty and respect, not manipulation and lies. Take care of yourselves, and remember that sometimes the family you choose becomes more important than the family you're born into.